It's July 26, 2026, and right now there are more than 20 United States Navy warships and hundreds of military aircraft sitting inside the Middle East theater, most of them clustered around the single most contested stretch of water on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. This isn't a routine deployment. This isn't a scheduled carrier rotation. This is a deliberate escalating buildup that President Trump personally ordered just days ago. And it's happening at the exact moment Iran is still trying to figure out whether it can keep bleeding international shipping without triggering the kind of response that finally ends its ability to threaten that waterway altogether. So let's break down exactly what's sailing into position, why it's happening right now, and why this specific naval posture might genuinely be Iran's worst nightmare unfolding in real time. Let's start with the raw numbers, because they tell you everything about the scale of what's actually happening out there. CENTCOM has confirmed that more than 20 Navy warships and hundreds of military aircraft are currently operating across the Middle East region, and that number has been building steadily since the naval blockade against Iran was reimposed on July 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. That blockade wasn't the first time this year either. This is actually a second wave. The United States originally imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports back on April 13th, following the collapse of the Islamabad talks. And that blockade ran all the way through late May before it was lifted as part of a broader diplomatic attempt to calm the situation down. It didn't work. Iran kept attacking tankers, kept threatening the strait, kept testing how far it could push before Washington snapped the door shut again. And on July 13th, Washington did exactly that, snapping it shut for the second time in 3 months. And the reason this second blockade got reimposed matters because it wasn't a preemptive move, it was a direct response to Iran violating the terms of an actual agreement. Back on June 17th, the United States and Iran had actually reached a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, laying out terms for how shipping through the strait would be handled going forward. And almost immediately after that agreement was signed, Iran started violating it. Within weeks, multiple tankers were getting struck in separate incidents. The Qatari liquefied and natural gas tanker Al Rikayat was hit by a projectile off the Omani coast, triggering an engine room fire that forced the crew to evacuate, though thankfully everyone made it off safely. The Saudi-flagged supertanker Wedian, loaded with crude oil, was damaged in a separate strike while transiting the strait. A third vessel, the Liberian-flagged MT Cyprus Prosperity, was also attacked around the same window. 3 tankers hit in a matter of days, right after Iran had signed onto an agreement specifically meant to prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening. So when people ask why the United States went back to a full naval blockade after already lifting one earlier in the year, the answer is right there. Iran signed the deal and broke it almost immediately. Let's talk about what this blockade actually looks like in practice. Because it's not just warships parked in the water looking intimidating, it's an active, ongoing interdiction operation with real, measurable results. Since the blockade began, CENTCOM has confirmed 85 vessels intercepted attempting to move to or from Iranian ports and coastal areas. 3 ships have been fully seized. According to Lloyd's List, which tracks global maritime traffic independently, roughly 26 vessels have managed to bypass the blockade, despite everything the Navy has thrown at this operation, which tells you Iran is still finding cracks to exploit. But the overwhelming majority of traffic attempting to move through is either being stopped, redirected, or seized outright. And the financial toll on Iran has been enormous. The United States estimates this blockade is costing Iran roughly $500 million every single day in lost oil revenue and trade. $500 million every day. That's not a minor inconvenience to a regime already dealing with economic strain and domestic unrest. That's a direct, sustained hemorrhage aimed squarely at the financial lifeline that funds everything else Iran does, from its ballistic missile program to its proxy network stretching from Yemen to Lebanon. Iran hasn't just sat back and absorbed that pain quietly, either. In direct retaliation for the blockade and the seizures, Iran has captured 2 cargo ships of its own, essentially trying to create leverage through hostage-taking on the open water. The same tactic they've leaned on for years whenever they feel cornered. And it's worth remembering the human cost sitting underneath all of these numbers, because this entire crisis has already produced real casualties long before this latest naval buildup even began. At least 1 tugboat has been sunk. More than 17 merchant ships have sustained damage throughout this crisis, with 7 of those so badly hit that they had to be abandoned entirely. 2 merchant ships were fully captured. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing across these incidents. A port worker in Bahrain was killed and 2 others wounded in a separate attack, tied to this same broader campaign. These aren't abstract statistics on a spreadsheet. These are real commercial sailors, ordinary working people, moving cargo through what used to be one of the busiest and most routine shipping lanes in the entire world. Now caught in the middle of a war they have absolutely nothing to do with. Let's rewind and put the full timeline together, because the sequencing here really shows you how this crisis has evolved in stages, each one more serious than the last. This entire Strait of Hormuz crisis technically traces back to February 28th, when the broader Iran war itself kicked off with the joint American and Israeli strike campaign. In the earliest phase, Iran responded by issuing blanket warnings forbidding passage through the strait entirely, then backed those warnings up by boarding and attacking merchant ships and laying sea mines throughout the waterway. That's a level of open, direct threat to global shipping that hadn't been seen at this scale in decades. Shipping firms, understandably, started suspending operations in the strait altogether rather than risk their vessels and crews. And remember, this isn't some minor regional waterway we're talking about. Before this entire war started, roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas moved through the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran started mining it and attacking ships indiscriminately, they weren't just threatening regional shipping, they were threatening a meaningful chunk of global energy supply, which is exactly why this crisis has had ripple effects reaching gas prices and fuel markets well beyond the Middle East itself. On March 19th, the United States launched a dedicated airstrike campaign specifically targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones, aimed directly at reopening the strait by physically destroying the assets Iran was using to threaten it. Israel's Air Force joined that effort as well, and in one particularly significant strike, Israel assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer, who was personally overseeing the blockade operation against the strait. Taking out the specific commander running Iran's blockade effort is exactly the kind of decapitation strike that's designed to create confusion and disrupt command continuity at a critical moment, and it set the stage for the United States to formally impose its own naval blockade on Iran less than a month later on April 13th, once the Islamabad talks aimed at resolving the crisis diplomatically had already collapsed. Then, on April 23rd, President Trump gave an order that removed almost all ambiguity from the rules of engagement out there, directing the U.S. Navy to destroy any Iranian boats caught laying mines in the strait. No warning shots, no extended negotiation window on the water. If an Iranian vessel is caught actively mining international shipping lanes, it gets destroyed. That's about as clear and aggressive a standing order as you can give a naval force operating in a contested waterway, and it tells you how seriously Washington was treating the mine threat specifically. Because naval mines are one of the cheapest, most asymmetric tools available to a country like Iran that can't match the United States ship for ship or missile for missile, a single mine can disable or sink a vessel worth hundreds of millions of dollars for a fraction of the cost to produce and deploy it. By May 3rd, Trump announced that the United States would help free up ships that were stuck or delayed in the strait. And the following day, on May 4th, that promise turned into an actual operation, Operation Project Freedom, a dedicated Navy mission specifically built to escort merchant ships safely out of the Gulf. That operation ran for a short but intense window from May 4th through May 6th, at a moment when maritime traffic through the strait was facing such severe restrictions that many commercial vessels were either delayed indefinitely or physically unable to move at all. Think about what that actually represents. The United States Navy running an active military escort operation specifically to rescue stranded commercial shipping trapped by Iranian threats, essentially treating global oil tankers the way you'd treat civilians needing evacuation from a war zone, because functionally, that's exactly what was happening to them. That first blockade phase eventually wound down by May 29th, coinciding with renewed diplomatic efforts, and the eventual signing of that June 17th Memorandum of Understanding meant to set clearer rules for how shipping through Hormuz would actually work going forward. And for a few weeks, it looked like maybe, just maybe, both sides were willing to hold to something resembling a stable arrangement. That illusion didn't survive long. Within weeks, Iran was back to striking tankers, the Al-Raqayyat, the Wedian, the Cyprus Prosperity, all hit in that same tight window in early July. And by July 13th, the United States was back to a full naval blockade, this time paired with an even larger, more visible show of force than the first round. Let's talk about exactly why Trump ordered this current buildup specifically. Because there's a direct, ugly reason behind it that shouldn't get lost in all the ship count numbers. This latest surge in military deployment followed recent Iranian attacks that killed 4 American service members. 4. That's not an abstract escalation, that's American lives lost. And it directly preceded the decision to widen the range of military options available in theater. The White House, when pressed on exactly what this buildup entails, kept things deliberately vague, simply stating that the president always has all options at his disposal, and the Pentagon has specifically declined to provide details about the exact scope and nature of these troop and naval movements, citing operational security. That kind of tight-lipped response, right after American deaths and right as ship numbers climb past 20, tells you this isn't a routine reinforcement. This is a posture specifically built to give the commander-in-chief every possible option on the table, from continuing the current strike and blockade campaign all the way up to something significantly larger, without tipping Iran off in advance about exactly which direction things are heading. And this buildup is happening against a backdrop where CENTCOM had, just days earlier, completed a 12th consecutive day of strikes inside Iran, part of that same sustained bombing campaign that's been running in parallel with the naval blockade this entire time. So you've got two enormous simultaneous pressure campaigns running at once right now, an air campaign systematically working through Iran's coastal defenses, missile storage, and command infrastructure, and a naval campaign physically strangling Iran's ability to move oil and goods in or out of its own ports. Neither one is happening in isolation. They're designed to reinforce each other. The airstrikes degrade the physical capability Iran would use to break the blockade, while the blockade starves the financial resources Iran would use to rebuild whatever the airstrikes destroy. Here's an analogy that actually captures what's happening in that strait right now pretty well. Picture a toll booth on the world's busiest highway, except instead of collecting a few dollars from each car that passes through, one driver has decided he's going to personally block the road, plant spike strips at random, and occasionally take pot shots at other drivers just trying to get to work. For a while, everyone just avoids that stretch of highway entirely, rerouting around it at enormous cost and delay. Then the highway patrol shows up, not with one cruiser, but with 20 patrol boats worth of firepower and hundreds of aircraft circling overhead, systematically clearing the spike strips, escorting stranded drivers through safely, and telling the guy, causing all the trouble, that every single spike strip he lays down from here forward gets him personally removed from the road. That's essentially what Operation Project Freedom was, and it's essentially what this current blockade and buildup represents too, just at a much larger and much more aggressive scale than the first attempt back in the spring. Let's get into the actual platforms and hardware sitting in that water right now, because more than 20 Navy warships isn't just a number, it represents an enormous concentration of capability. That kind of surface fleet presence typically includes a mix of guided missile destroyers and cruisers running the Aegis combat system, giving the entire fleet a networked, shared picture of every threat in the air, on the surface, and potentially underwater across the entire theater simultaneously. It likely includes amphibious assault capability as well, given the numbers of Marines and sailors that have rotated through this theater on ships like the Tripoli earlier in this crisis, carrying thousands of personnel in their own organic strike aircraft. And hundreds of military aircraft operating in support means you're looking at everything from fighter cover flying, combat air patrols over the fleet, to maritime patrol aircraft sweeping for mines and small boat threats, to tanker aircraft, keeping everything topped off and airborne around the clock. This is, in every meaningful sense, a full theater-level combined force posture, not a token gesture. Iran, for its part, hasn't just been sitting there absorbing this pressure without trying to respond on the technology side as well. Back in February, months before this current buildup, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Navy tested a new naval air defense missile specifically inside the Strait of Hormuz, the Sayyad-3G, a naval adaptation of their existing land-based Sayyad-3 system. That missile has a reported range of roughly 150 kilometers, close to 93 miles, and can be launched directly from ship-based vertical launch systems, specifically designed to intercept military aircraft, maritime patrol planes, and high-altitude drones. It's built to integrate directly into a ship's existing radar and command network while also maintaining independent tracking capability of its own. And notably, that particular test happened during joint naval drills with Russia near Bandar Abbas, with Russian and Iranian vessels simulating a hijacked vessel rescue scenario together. Let's talk about the human dimension sitting on the commercial side of this crisis too, because it's easy to get lost in warship counts and blockade statistics and forget that every single tanker moving through that strait right now has a crew of real people on board, often numbering anywhere from 20 to 30 sailors per vessel, many of them from countries with no direct stake in this war at all, Filipino, Indian, and Eastern European crews who make up a huge share of the global merchant marine workforce. Every time a tanker gets struck by a projectile or forced to divert around a minefield, those are the people absorbing the actual physical risk, not policymakers in Washington or commanders in Tehran. The 12 seafarers killed or missing throughout this crisis, and the port worker killed in Bahrain, represent the human cost of a geopolitical standoff that most of them had no say in whatsoever. And that's part of why global shipping unions and maritime safety organizations have been pushing so hard for exactly the kind of sustained naval escort presence this buildup now represents. Because for months, before Operation Project Freedom and before this current surge, the alternative for a lot of crews was simply refusing to sail into the strait at all, leaving vessels and their cargo stranded indefinitely, rather than risk lives on a gamble that Iran wouldn't target their specific ship. There's also a massive insurance and shipping industry ripple effect worth understanding here, because none of this happens in a vacuum separate from the broader economics of global trade. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz have reportedly spiked dramatically throughout this crisis, in some cases adding costs that run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single tanker's transit, on top of the delays and rerouting costs shipping companies have already absorbed. That kind of cost increase gets passed down the entire supply chain eventually, showing up in fuel prices and shipping delays for goods that have nothing to do with oil at all, and in the broader inflationary pressure that's been squeezing economies well beyond the Middle East throughout this entire war. A naval buildup this size, backed by an active blockade and a sustained airstrike campaign, is partly aimed at bringing those insurance and risk calculations back down to something resembling normal, because a strait that requires this level of military escort to function safely is fundamentally more expensive for the entire world to use. And every additional day this crisis drags on adds to a bill that ultimately gets paid by consumers and businesses everywhere, not just the countries directly involved in the fighting. It's also worth examining who's actually still buying Iranian oil despite this blockade, because that relationship is central to understanding whether $500 million a day in losses is actually enough pressure to change Tehran's calculus. China has remained by far the largest buyer of Iranian crude throughout this entire crisis, often through a shadow fleet of tankers using ship-to-ship transfers, falsified documentation, and flags of convenience specifically designed to obscure the true origin of the cargo and slip past exactly the kind of interdiction operation the Navy is currently running. Every one of those 85 interceptions and 3 seizures represents a direct hit against that shadow trade network, forcing Chinese buyers and Iranian exporters alike to take on greater risk, pay higher costs for evasion tactics, and accept longer delays getting crude to market. But as long as China continues to see enough strategic value in keeping Iran's oil flowing, whether for its own energy security or simply to keep a geopolitical thorn lodged in Washington's side, Iran retains at least some financial lifeline even under blockade conditions, which is exactly why this naval buildup needed to be this large and this sustained rather than a token gesture. Because a half-hearted blockade with gaps large enough for a determined shadow fleet to exploit wouldn't come close to generating the kind of daily financial pain currently being inflicted. There's a final piece of this puzzle worth sitting with, and that's how this entire naval buildup interacts with the diplomatic track that's been running in parallel this whole time. Reports out of the region indicate Omani officials have continued shuttling between Washington and Tehran throughout this latest escalation, the same channel that's been used repeatedly since this crisis began back in February to try to find some kind of durable framework both sides can actually live with. A buildup this size, sitting directly behind any renewed round of talks, changes the negotiating dynamic considerably, because it's no longer diplomacy happening in a vacuum, it's diplomacy happening in the shadow of 20 warships and a strike campaign that's already passed the 2-week mark. That combination, overwhelming visible force paired with an open diplomatic channel, is a deliberate strategy, not a contradiction. The idea being that Iran negotiates far more seriously when the alternative, sitting right outside its territorial waters, looks genuinely unbearable to continue absorbing, rather than when the pressure feels temporary or survivable enough to simply wait out. Let's dig a little deeper into what this buildup means for the broader Gulf security picture, because the Strait of Hormuz has never existed in isolation from the countries sitting directly on either side of it. Every Gulf state, from Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates to Qatar to Oman, depends on that waterway remaining open and stable. And every single one of them has been watching this crisis with a mixture of relief that the United States is willing to commit this level of force to keeping it open, and nervousness that a buildup this large could just as easily tip into something far more destabilizing if Iran decides to respond with a major escalation of its own rather than backing down. That's part of why Trump's pivot toward having Gulf states fund security costs through trade and investment deals rather than a direct shipping toll matters so much strategically. It ties those regional partners more directly into the financial stake of keeping this operation sustainable rather than leaving Washington to shoulder the entire cost of protecting a waterway that benefits the entire global economy far more broadly than it benefits the United States alone. And there's a longer-term question sitting underneath all of this that's worth raising before wrapping up, which is what happens to the Strait's security architecture once this specific crisis eventually winds down, however it ends. A recurring theme throughout this entire saga has been the emergence of a body being referred to as the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a framework apparently being developed specifically to manage security and shipping coordination through Hormuz going forward, separate from the ad hoc blockade and escort operations that have defined this crisis so far. If that kind of standing authority actually takes shape as a lasting institution rather than just a wartime improvisation, it could represent one of the most significant structural changes to how this critical waterway gets managed in decades, shifting from a system where Iran could unilaterally threaten passage whenever it wanted leverage towards something resembling an internationally coordinated security framework that doesn't depend entirely on the United States Navy showing up with 20 warships every single time tensions flare. Whether that actually happens, or whether this current buildup simply becomes the latest chapter in a cycle that repeats itself again in a few months, once attention shifts elsewhere, is genuinely one of the biggest open questions hanging over the entire second half of this year. That Russian naval cooperation piece matters here because it means whatever air defense and detection improvements Iran has been working into its coastal and naval systems likely carry at least some fingerprints of Russian design assistance or shared expertise, the same underlying concern that's shown up repeatedly throughout this entire war whenever Iranian capability seems to be adapting faster than pure domestic development would normally allow. Let's talk honestly about what all of this actually accomplishes and what it doesn't, because it's important not to oversell where things genuinely stand. Despite months of blockade, months of airstrikes, and now this massive naval buildup, Iran still managed to strike 3 separate tankers in the days right before this latest surge, which tells you the underlying threat to shipping in that strait has not been fully eliminated, only suppressed, and made significantly more costly for Iran to sustain. The 26 vessels that Lloyd's list says have managed to bypass the blockade, despite everything the Navy has thrown at this operation, is proof that even an enormously resourced interdiction campaign can't achieve 100% coverage across a waterway, this geographically complex with countless small inlets, alternate routes, and gray zone tactics available to anyone determined enough to exploit them. And Iran's decision to seize 2 cargo ships in direct retaliation shows they're still willing to escalate right back whenever they feel pressure building past a certain threshold, rather than simply folding under the weight of the blockade. But here's the honesty check running the other direction too. $500 million a day in lost revenue is not a number. Any government, especially one already dealing with domestic unrest and economic strain, can absorb indefinitely without real consequences building underneath the surface. 85 vessels intercepted and 3 fully seized represents a genuinely significant degradation of Iran's ability to move goods and revenue through its own coastline. And the buildup happening right now, more than 20 warships, hundreds of aircraft, an order specifically authorizing destruction of any vessel caught laying mines, all of it stacked directly on top of an active 12-plus day airstrike campaign against the Iranian mainland, represents a level of combined pressure that's genuinely unprecedented even within the scope of this already lengthy 5-month-long war. Let's zoom out to the strategic picture here, because that's really where the significance of this specific naval buildup lives. Iran's entire economic model, going back decades, has depended on controlling, or at minimum credibly threatening, the Strait of Hormuz, using that leverage to extract concessions, deter outside pressure, and fund everything from its ballistic missile program to its network of regional proxies. Every single time Iran has tried to use that leverage throughout this current crisis, laying mines, boarding ships, launching projectiles at tankers, capturing vessels in retaliation, the United States' response has escalated in direct proportion, moving from targeted airstrikes against naval assets to a formal blockade, to an active rescue operation for stranded shipping, to assassinating the specific commander running Iran's blockade effort, and now to this massive, deliberately ambiguous buildup that the White House won't fully detail and the Pentagon won't specify. Each escalation has made Iran's core strategic asset, control over that waterway, progressively less valuable and progressively more expensive to maintain. If Iran genuinely cannot find a way to credibly threaten Hormuz without triggering exactly this kind of overwhelming, sustained counterpressure, then the entire foundation of their regional leverage strategy for the last several decades starts to genuinely crumble, and that's precisely why this particular naval buildup, more than any single airstrike or any single tanker attack, might end up being remembered as the moment this crisis actually turned. There's also a broader energy market dimension worth understanding here, because this isn't purely a regional military story, it's a global economic one too. With roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of global liquefied natural gas normally moving through this exact stretch of water, every escalation in this crisis has direct ripple effects on fuel prices and energy security reaching countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict directly. That's part of why Trump's brief flirtation with charging commercial shippers a 20% cargo value fee to help cover the cost of providing security through the strait caused such an immediate stir before he reversed course within a single day and said Gulf Arab states would instead make trade and investment deals to help cover those costs going forward. That back and forth, floating a toll, then walking it back within 24 hours, shows just how delicate the balancing act is here. Washington wants to maintain enough naval presence to keep the strait functionally open, without turning that presence into such a direct financial burden on global shipping that it ends up alienating the exact commercial partners and Gulf allies whose cooperation this entire strategy depends on. So where does this leave things right now, with more than 20 warships and hundreds of aircraft sitting in theater, a blockade actively costing Iran $500 million every single day, an ongoing airstrike campaign that had already reached 12 consecutive days before this latest surge began, and a White House deliberately keeping the exact scope of this buildup vague enough that Iran has to plan for every possible outcome simultaneously? This is pressure being applied from essentially every available direction at once, financial, military, and psychological. And it's happening specifically because the previous rounds of pressure, real as they were, still weren't enough to stop Iran from attacking 3 tankers in a single week right before this buildup began. That tells you Washington has concluded that the only way to genuinely close this chapter of the crisis is to make the cost of continuing to threaten that strait so unbearably high, so comprehensively enforced from the air, on the surface, and financially, that Iran simply runs out of viable options for keeping this fight going without risking something far more catastrophic than anything they've faced so far in this 5-month war. What do you think happens next in that strait? Does this level of naval buildup finally force Iran to genuinely stand down and respect whatever comes out of the next round of talks? Or do you think they find another workaround, another gray zone tactic to keep chipping away at shipping traffic, despite everything currently sitting in that water? Do you think this buildup is really just about defending the blockade? Or do you think it's actually laying the groundwork for something bigger down the line? Let me know what you think in the comments, because with 4 American service members already lost to recent Iranian attacks and a fleet this size now sitting in position, the stakes here genuinely could not be higher. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand what's happening beneath the headlines, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next update. Because with a buildup this significant and a Pentagon this tight-lipped about the details, there's a very real chance the next major development comes faster than anyone expects. Share this with anyone trying to follow what's actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, because between the blockade numbers, the casualty figures, and this latest surge in naval and air power, this is exactly the kind of story where the full picture only makes sense once you see every piece laid out together, rather than scattered across a dozen separate headlines.